This is tape number 3 with Peter Avery. Well, it would probably wouldn't have had so much quarreling.
So this is to talk about the period after 1963. 1963 was one of the turning points.
But wait a minute, I would like to go back to 53 now.
But to return to 1953, because you must understand that I was no longer living in Iran in 1963. I left Iran in the end of 1957. To go back to the 1953 period.
What happened? So you were there when the Shah left
Fall
the first
of
time?
Mossadegh. No, I was not. I was in Baghdad when the Shah fled over Hussein Fatemi, the foreign minister, and Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister's attempt to ensure the establishment of an Islamic republic. Mossadegh, after all, consistently following the line he followed as one of those who, in 1925, in the Constituent Assembly, established to decide the constitutional position with the departure of the Qajar dynasty, had voted against the Reza Khan or Reza Shah Pahlavi's assumption of sovereignty. Mossadegh was a consistent opponent of the Pahlavi regime, after all. And of course, Mossadegh, at the end of his premiership in 1953, had attempted to present the Shah with an ultimatum the Shah couldn't accept over the commander-in-chiefship of the armed forces, claiming it for the prime minister. And the Shah fled Iran. I was in Baghdad at the time, teaching in the Kulliyat al-Adab Ulum, the College of Arts and Sciences, University College in Iraq, when the Agent Presse France representative, who was a friend of mine, suddenly telephoned me in the middle of the morning and said the Shah of Iran and his wife were at the airport. I was very surprised, as everybody was. And King Faisal had a diplomatic cold and couldn't see them, but placed a palace at their disposal. However, they flew on that evening, 2 people having been pushed off the scheduled flight of BOAC, the Shah of Persia and his spouse flew on to Rome. And as the world now knows, of course, they eventually, not many days later, I think about 3 days later, returned to Iran in triumph. A coup d'etat having been staged with Zahedi at its head, which everybody claims, and historians have attempted to substantiate that. The United States, through its CIA organization, had heavily supported. This coup d'etat had taken place, and demonstrators who demonstrated in favor of Mossadegh, including members of the communist faction, the Tudeh party, suddenly turned round and turned against Mossadegh, and so the Shah's men won, and the Shah was restored.
What do you think it was, aside from the CIA? Let us set aside the CIA, because I really never believe that any organization can, by distributing dollar notes, actually, raise suddenly 100,000 people to go and shout in the street. I think that there must have been other underlying factors, such as fear of chaos and fear of anarchy, and what might happen,
I entirely agree with you. I think it's a great pity that the Iranians, commenting on the history of their country, can never convince themselves that they, by themselves, are capable of changing the situation. They always have to blame foreign agencies for any action that occurs, which of course foreign agencies cannot entirely, as we've seen in more recent years under the Khomeini regime, foreign agencies cannot, of course, entirely affect changes if the people are against them. And I think the people were tired of Mossadegh and of the economic chaos that the country was being reduced to under Mossadegh's government without any oil revenues coming in. The treasury was empty, and this was widely known, widely commented upon by Iranians, that there was nothing in the treasury. And the Iranians are essentially a nation of traders, a fact which is not, I think, sufficiently understood or emphasized. Even if it is understood, it's not sufficiently stated. It's always worth remembering that one of the survival qualities of Iran, and Iran's survival is always being commented upon, but how does this survival take effect? What are the causes of it? One of the main survival threads in Iranian history is its capacity as a middle nation, a middle place, geographically placed world of merchants and traders, people who handle goods, pass goods on. In the old days, of course, along the Silk Road from the Far East, but always a nation of goods handlers, of traders. This is very basic. This is why Iranians are so pragmatic, because they are all potentially merchants. They are not soldiers. They are pacific people. They're not warriors, really. They're much more pragmatic merchants, men of the bazaar, of the marketplace. Deep down, their most lasting and most subtle relationships with the external world are the relationships of marketplaces, the relationships of merchants. And whenever I think of the way Iran has survived through the ages, I always remember once wanting to go from Baghdad to Isfahan, saying to a friend of mine in Baghdad, how shall I arrange for the transfer of money to Isfahan? And he said, come with me tomorrow morning into the bazaar. And he took me into the bazaar, the souk, to a little old man in a tiny little boutique. And he said, give him your £100 or whatever the sum is you require. It was in fact 100 Iraqi dinars, in those days equivalent to £100, which I did, and the old man gave me in return a small piece of brown packing paper, not much bigger than the average postage stamp, on which he scribbled something in siyak, in that letter, alphabetical type of notation that old-fashioned Islamic merchants used to use, and which was an international language, code, financial code, and said, take this to the third on the left in the coppersmith's bazaar. That's all. I was rather apprehensive. It wasn't much to have in return for £100. However, I got to Isfahan, and the first morning I walked out and found the third on the left in the coppersmith's bazaar, and handed him this scrap of paper, to which he responded by saying, yes, how do you want it? Do you want to collect a sum each week so that I act as your banker? Or do you want it all now? And I said, oh, I'd be very grateful if you could just keep it for me, and I'll come and get some each week as I need it. And this is one of the great strengths of the Islamic world and of Iran. It was suddenly revealed to me that underneath the rise and fall of sultans and the interchange of governments and the exercise of foreign influences and all the rest of what makes up most of what's in our history books, underneath this, here was something that must have been going on for centuries. Little old men in the third boutique on the left in such and such a bazaar, who could send a tiny piece of paper with a mark on it to somebody else which would represent £100 and be quite sufficient. Here was a subtle substratum of power, and it was a power associated with the bazaars. If you want to take it further and think in terms of the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in 745-750 AD, again I believe it was through networks of merchants from Medina to Merv that the news, the propaganda, the instructions, the organization was spread. If you want to take it to the rise of Khomeini, from 1963 onwards to 1979 and the revolution, it was again merchants who entirely financed the whole affair. So there we are. Anyway, this is a long digression.
But this is interesting simply because one of the theories of the discontent which contribute to the fall of the Shah is that by giving a lot of free rein to new
the traditional
bazaar,
the traditional ways of mercantile practice in Iran were threatened by a government, the Pahlavi government, with its modern ideas. It's what they used to call its boulevard trade or avenue trade, as opposed to the old bazaar methods of trading. The establishment of things like department stores and that kind of thing. The bazaar merchants felt gravely threatened, and this was one of the aspects of the threat to traditional ways and cherished traditional mores that the Pahlavi government presented, and which I believe was one of the major factors in the opposition to the Pahlavis. However, in 1953,
could it have been avoided? I mean, could one have introduced modern methods of trade and kept the bazaris happy?
It's very important. There's a phrase, isn't there, in the Persian language, "Bekenar amadan," "Tesi bekenar amadan," to go to one side. Literally, I suppose it means coming to one side with somebody. It's very important in Iranian conditions, which are said to be characterized by individualism. What this individualism, I suppose, really means is that everybody considers that their dignity and their capacity to participate and to contribute to the life of the community necessitates having the right to be consulted. One of the things that rulers in Iran have to do is to work on a consensus basis. Iran is, as it were, naturally, instinctively democratic insofar as Iranians do like to be consulted and like things to work on a consensus basis. And one of the ways in which Iran could have been reformed successfully was if the great merchants and the more pragmatic elements of the society, not necessarily idle landed magnates who played at politics as if it were another extension of the other games they played, gambling mostly, games, a nation of gamblers, you could say they represented. Not that sort of person, but pragmatic people who had a real stake in the country, and this really is the merchants, the traders, and the businessmen, and so on. There should have been far more consultancy. Instead of the assumption by the head of the state that his subjects needed leading, needed educating, that it was his mission to lead and educate them, that they were naive and didn't understand modern ways. This was an extremely incorrect and arrogant assumption to make, I believe.
So anyway, you were in Baghdad and the Shah left and came back. And so what happened then? Did you go back to Iran?
In 1954, an Iranian friend of mine, with whom I'd left some books and rugs and things when I left Iran on the nationalization of the oil company, wrote to me and said he didn't even know where I was. He found me by writing to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, who gave him my home address, and eventually a letter reached me to say, why didn't I go up to Tehran and claim these rugs and possessions?
Why did you have to leave after the nationalization?
Well, no, as I've said earlier on in an earlier tape, but we were all evacuated from the oil company. So I went up to Tehran, and of course found it in the grip of fear due to the first anti-communist purge that was going on. And indeed discovered that my friend's real reason for wanting to see me was that he wanted me to help him to get out. He was in danger of being taken on suspicion of being a communist.
He wanted you to help him get out.
Yes, he wanted me to help him get out. He got a job as Persian lecturer at Cambridge due to my recommendation. He had been my assistant in the oil company.
What's his name?
Education department. Well, since he's still alive and in London, I won't give his name. Anyway, he was not arrested. He escaped and came to England, and he did a PhD in Cambridge, and he later went back to the oil company. That was my first return to Iran since 1951. And then in 1955, a friend of mine who was technical director and a big civil engineer of the Molam company, which had got a great contract for road building, invited me to become the PA to their general manager. So in 1955 I returned and stayed there until coming to Cambridge at the end of 1957. A very interesting experience it was. And this was an Iran that was attempting, with help from the World Monetary Fund and the International Bank, to restore itself and get itself placed for a big development takeoff by means of, first of all, establishing the necessary technological infrastructure which it so badly lacked. So you can say that the process that was embarked upon between 1954 and 1958 for the restoration and revivification of an Iran that had been allowed to run down very badly under the Sadek might have been high on the satisfaction of the aspirations for freedom and abstractions of that kind, but it was very low on actual maintenance of roads, maintenance of the railway system, and extremely low on providing money for these activities. So General Zahedi's government set about, I think very efficiently indeed, with valuable help from the experts of the World Bank and so on, to, first of all, to tackle things like the roads, because the roads in Iran by this time were very bad indeed. They'd been started under the reign of Reza Shah in the 30s with the advent of the motor car. They'd been rapidly expanded during the war for the movement of Lend-Lease goods from the Gulf to the Caspian and Russian borders. But they'd not been maintained, and therefore by 1955 they were badly broken up as to be almost unusable. A lot of the roads, in fact, weren't being used. Lorries just developed tracks beside them where it was possible on flat ground. So I was became part of this movement to redevelop the country and set about valuable basic construction work. But I left in 1958, and it was 63 was the next turning point at which I became very much aware.
What during that period, what, aside from that, you were in contact
with
your own friends with the literary world and so on?
Yes, I'd had friends in the literary world, acquaintances with which I could in some instances resume. صادق Hidayat, of course, was dead. Bzurg was in exile abroad. Bakai I never met again, the founder of the Toilers Party. But I've known Masood Farzad for years. Masood Farzad, the Shirazi. Yes, he was very close to me, but of course I knew him mostly in London, because he lived mostly in London. The last time I saw him was in Shiraz, to which he retired just before his death. He'd been a close associate in earlier days with صادق Hidayat and collaborated with him in the book on vegetarianism and other works. And I have somewhere a photograph of them together.
Anjabi, who was here?
Said Anjabi was another friend who became a friend during my 55 and 57 period in Iran, who was a very close friend of صادق Hidayat's and close to him when he died in Paris. And and of course I saw a great deal of people like Dr. Khan Lari, Mujtaba Minovi, and other scholars with whom I shared scholarly interests and from whom I learned a great deal about Persian literature, though I learned most from the person I was with most of the time, and that was Said Sadegh Gohareen, whom I became extremely close to, and with whom I began the translation of the Mantiq Tayr of Fariduddin Attar, which I am at long last, 30 years later, bringing to a conclusion, a translation which will be fully annotated and constitute a sort of encyclopedia of Sufism and of Islamic theology, I think, by the time we're finished, because the Mantiq Tayr is such a seminal work, so absolutely central to the understanding both of Islam and of Sufism, or particularly, of course, of the latter. Well, I began that on manuscripts that Minavi had discovered, two manuscripts in Turkey, in Ankara and Istanbul, two extremely ancient manuscripts which were much purer and nearer what we believe to be the original text than any manuscripts that have been seen before. So that whilst I was PA to the general manager of a road building operation during the day, during the nights I was the student of Sufism and Persian letters and was busy translating the Mantiq Tayr and working on other things in Said Sadegh Gohareen's library. I lived a sort of double life, and it was an extremely interesting and fruitful period for me. The other aspect of the job which was useful and constructive to me as the student of Iran was that I was enabled to get all over Iran, and secondly to practice the language at all levels as an interpreter, interpreting in weekly meetings between my principals and Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, who was the managing director of the Iranian Plan Organization, who were our clients. We were engineers working for the Plan Organization. So I was at meetings there, which were conducted in English, French, and Persian, and I had to be the interpreter in all three languages. And also, of course, I had meetings, frequent meetings, with the Minister of Roads and Railways, Team Sar, General Ansari, with whom I became extremely friendly, as I did with Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, who became close friends of mine, and were both men I greatly admired. Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, of course, was an exceptionally dynamic and clever man, whose great fault was, as I frequently told him, because my communications with these men, I was friendly enough with them for my communications to be extremely frank and open. We treated each other as real friends, as one can do with Iranians who become real friends. Men of immense sophistication and openness of character and mind. Dil bedil dorad, as Sadiq Hidayat had taught me all those years before. Heart finds a way to the heart. And as I frequently told Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, his great flaw was that he never listened to anybody. I said that on the whole I believe great men, including even Napoleon and certainly the Duke of Wellington, generally to have been great listeners. But I said I'd never seen him listen to anybody. He was always finishing other people's sentences for them and talking them down. And this I thought was a pity. But of course it was one of the tragedies of the later years of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's dreary reign, which ended in the dreariest of revolutions, that anybody at all critical of him, such as Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, were very quickly driven out of affairs, driven out of politics, and mistreated. I mean, Abul Hassan Ebtihaj was, after all, kept in durance vile, in the vilest kind of imprisonment for quite a long time, with all sorts of ridiculous charges being held over him, and eventually released in Dale terms, which it would have been impossible for the entire financial community of the world, actually, to have sustained.
What were the charges?
Millions. Oh, charges of interference, speculation, corruption, and so on. Charges which were totally unjust. Never was there a more honest and more straightforward and more uncorrupt official in any government in the world than Abul Hassan Ebtahaj. He was a very, very fine man, and a man I greatly admire, and I'm happy to say that friends who see him in his exile these days, I believe somewhere in the south of France, have pleased and flattered me no end by telling me that in his conversations with them he always speaks well of me, and I would like to use this opportunity to reciprocate this. He was a very great man and a good friend, a person it was a joy to be with, witty, experienced, worldly, learned, and of the best character of Iranian, and when you get a good Iranian you can find no one better. Timsar Ansari was the sort of official and friend who, as soon as he noticed that I was tired and getting a little bit worn, suddenly gave me instructions, gave me, as he put it, orders to go to the north and stay in one of the hotels and have a drezine, a small inspection train, put at my disposal on the railway line so that I could go for trips and see various Safavid remains in that area between Babusar and Astarabad and in that area of the country. That was the kind of thing, a little holiday arranged for me, with every courtesy and kindness, and an Iranian gentleman allowed to accompany me to act as my escort and to look after whatever it was I needed. And I remember reading the Tariq Sistan during that trip, sitting in the garden of the hotel of Babusar, reading this great history when I wasn't being taken on interesting trips exploring historical remains, or wasn't having a swim in the Caspian Sea. These are the happy memories of Iran that the memory of which moves me deeply, because I have to say that the principal joys and all the most enriching experiences of my life have been associated with that country. And therefore one is extremely glad, in my case anyway, at being a student of Iran.
Well, so those were the years that you spent there, and what was the atmosphere like? I mean, there was a feeling of renewal, that things were moving
was the feeling
and rebuilding.
There was an attempt on the part of the government, especially on the part of Zahedi, Prime Minister Zahedi and his associates, to get things moving. Tout le monde est de temps en temps égoïste, as Ahmad Shah is supposed to have said. A lot of this movement, of course, was not to be dissociated from self-interest on the part of some of the parties concerned in it. Great families, like the Rashidians and certain members of the Hidayat family, incidentally, relations of my late friend صادق Hidayat, and other great groups, had formed groups to promote civil engineering, to become contractors, and to acquire plant, earth-moving equipment and that sort of thing, which Iran was extremely low in, and which it was part of the revival program to ensure that Iran had adequate supplies of, but supplies of which would be whilst financed on credit forwarded by the British government and other Western governments, supplies which would remain in the hands, a monopoly of in the hands of a very few, which would have given that very few, of course, very great political power, because they would have been in control of a vital technological requirement. These are aspects of modern Iranian history that one mentioning and certainly treating in more detail where the occasion presents itself. So there was a lot of this going on, and therefore you ask about the atmosphere, the prospects for the future as I saw it. Whilst I was aware of this dynamic desire to improve the infrastructure, I was also haunted by the belief that the Pahlavi regime was doomed, a belief that came to me strongly in 1955 in the context of that bogs I've mentioned earlier, in the context of what was going on, what was being done to people, and the people's gradual alienation from the Shah, and the feeling that there was the danger, as I saw it then, of a communist takeover. I remember being almost haunted by a strange sort of hunch or premonition as I crossed one winter's evening an empty Takht-i Jamshid, as it was called, a big avenue stretching across northern Tehran in those days, and seeing a rather broken down truck going along and nothing else, and thinking to myself, is Iran going someday to be like this, silent, oppressed, tyrannized over, a satellite perhaps of Russia, Tehran, a city of southern Russia, something out of a Gorky short story, paint peeling off doors, snow, frozen slush in the winter time, people hungry and queuing for food. A very strange sort of premonition.